I went camping alone in northern Pennsylvania during the summer of 2016. I was 26 at the time, restless and tired of working long shifts in a warehouse. I just wanted quiet, somewhere to sit by a fire, hear nothing but trees and wind, and not think about anything for a while. I'd found a small, unofficial campground deep off Route 19, near a place called Kettle Creek. It wasn't one of those organized campgrounds with bathrooms or other people. It was just a patch of woods near a lake, miles from any cell signal. That was what I wanted, complete isolation. The drive there took longer than I thought. Once I left the main road, the trail narrowed down to gravel and then to a rough dirt path full of dips and rocks. My old Ford Ranger groaned every time I hit a bump, and my GPS stopped working halfway in. The trees were thick and close on both sides, almost blocking out the sunlight. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no cars, nothing but the constant crunch of my tires on gravel. It felt peaceful, but in that kind of peace where you start to realize how empty a place can really be. I reached a clearing near dusk. It wasn't much, just a flat stretch of dirt beside the lake, surrounded by tall pines. The water looked calm and black under the fading light. I parked the truck, unloaded my gear, and set up my tent about 20 feet from the lake's edge. By the time I got a fire going, the sky had gone deep blue, and the woods behind me had gone completely still. I ate canned beans straight from the tin, then sat with my feet near the fire, just listening. The air smelled like damp wood and pine needles. I stayed like that for a while, watching the flames twist and crackle. Every few minutes, I'd hear a splash in the lake or a branch snapping somewhere behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It's the woods, things move. But after a while, it started to feel like those sounds weren't random. They came in little bursts, then nothing, then again closer. The kind of sound that makes you lift your head and stare into the trees, but you can't see anything. When it got close to midnight, I doused the fire down to embers and went into my tent. I left one lantern outside, hanging by the zipper. I lay there for a while, scrolling through old pictures on my phone even though I had no signal. Eventually, I dozed off. I woke up sometime later. It was still dark, probably around 2 or 3 in the morning. I couldn't tell what woke me at first, but then I heard it again. Slow, heavy footsteps moving somewhere near my tent. I froze. The sound was soft, but close enough that I could tell it wasn't an animal moving on 4 legs. It was slow and deliberate, like someone walking carefully through the undergrowth. My first thought was maybe another camper or a hunter passing by, but there were no other cars out there, and I hadn't seen a single sign of life all day. The footsteps stopped near the fire pit. I could hear faint crunches of gravel, then the sound of something brushing against my cooler. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The thin nylon wall of the tent felt useless between me and whatever was outside. My heartbeat was loud enough that I thought it might give me away. A minute passed, then another. I finally reached slowly for the flashlight beside me. I didn't unzip the tent, just shined the beam through the thin fabric. The shadow outside shifted slightly. I couldn't make out a shape, just a blur of movement. It stood still for several seconds, then turned away. I heard slow steps fading toward the lake. I lay awake until dawn. The moment the first bit of gray light came through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The air was damp, and a thin mist hung low over the water. My cooler had been moved a few feet from where I left it. The lid was half open. One of the latches had been broken off. A few cans of food were missing. My firewood pile looked disturbed too, like someone had kicked through it. There were footprints in the dirt, bare footprints, not boots or shoes, just long, flat feet pressed deep into the mud leading down toward the lake. I followed them for a bit, but they disappeared at the edge of the water. I told myself maybe it was some local drunk wandering around, maybe someone living off the grid nearby. I tried not to think too much about it. I packed up the broken latch, checked my gear, and spent the morning fishing to calm down. The day passed without anything strange. I convinced myself that maybe I'd overreacted. That night, I built a larger fire and moved my tent a little closer to it. I kept my knife beside my sleeping bag and my flashlight within reach. Around 10, I heard distant thunder. A storm was rolling in from the west. Within an hour, rain was coming down hard. I sat under the tarp I'd hung up, watching water drip off the edges, listening to the steady rumble of thunder. The woods smelled sharp and clean, like wet earth. I felt safer with the rain. The noise made me feel less alone. When I finally went to sleep, it must have been close to midnight again. The storm hadn't stopped, but it had softened to a drizzle. I woke up to a sound I'll never forget: the rip of fabric. The side of my tent tore open from the outside, clean down the middle. Cold rain hit my face as I sat up, my heart slamming in my chest. My flashlight beam caught movement. A figure crouched just outside the torn fabric, half in the shadows, half in the light. It wasn't a ghost or some creature. It was a man. His clothes were soaked and filthy, hanging loose off his frame. His skin was pale and covered in mud. He looked like he hadn't bathed or eaten properly in weeks. His eyes were wide open, and even though I couldn't see them clearly, I could tell something was wrong with him. He didn't say a word, just stared at me for a few seconds before bolting back into the trees. I grabbed my knife and stumbled out into the rain, shining my light through the trees. The beam caught glimpses of wet branches, the shimmer of raindrops, and nothing else. No sound but the rain. I didn't chase him. I didn't pack anything. I just sat there by the fire until dawn, shaking. When the sun came up, I saw muddy prints leading around my tent, circling it multiple times. There were handprints, too, smeared on the back of my truck and cooler. The strange thing was, I found some torn-up fabric a few yards away. It looked like part of an old shirt, soaked and shredded, as if someone had been living out there for a long time. I packed everything as fast as I could. I didn't bother folding the tent. I stuffed it in the truck bed, threw everything else on top, and drove out. My tires spun in the mud before catching grip. I didn't stop until I hit the main road, and I didn't look in the mirror until I was at least 20 miles away. Later that week, when I was back home, I looked up the area online. I found an old local news post about a man who'd gone missing near Kettle Creek a few years earlier. They never found him. Some hikers claim to have seen signs of someone living in the woods, stealing food and gear from campsites. The last sighting had been near Route 19, close to where I'd been. I never went back there. I still go camping sometimes, but never alone, and never without checking the area first. Every time I hear something in the woods at night, no matter how small, it takes me back to that moment. The tear of my tent, the flash of those pale eyes, the sound of rain hitting the ground between us. People say the woods are peaceful. I used to think that too. But out there, when it's just you and miles of trees, you realize peace can turn into something else entirely. Something that listens, waits, and watches when you least expect it. I still have that tent. The tier is stitched up, but I keep it as it is, just as a reminder. Not of fear, but of the fact that out there, the scariest thing you can find isn't something supernatural. It's just another person, one who's been alone too long. It was late September of 2019 when I decided to go on a solo camping trip in northern Arizona. I had been working long weeks at a construction job in Flagstaff and just wanted some quiet, some place where I wouldn't hear engines or people yelling. I picked an area near the Kaibab National Forest, not too far from the Utah border. I had been there once before with a friend, years back, and remembered the tall pines, the long dirt roads, and how the nights felt heavy with silence. I left early in the morning, stopped in a small town for gas and food, then drove for a few hours on winding roads that turned to gravel and then dirt. My truck rattled the whole way. The deeper I went, the less signs of life I saw. The sky was pale blue and cloudless. By the time I found a clearing big enough to set up my tent, the sun had already started to lower, giving the trees that dim gold tint. The air smelled like pine sap and dry dirt. I parked near a slope where I could see a narrow stream running below. I unpacked, set up my small green tent, and built a fire pit out of rocks. I had packed simple food, canned chili, protein bars, and a few bottles of water. After I ate, I just sat by the fire, listening. The forest was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet where every crack of a twig feels louder than it should. When it got darker, I turned off my phone's flashlight and just watched the fire fade. The night sky above was packed with stars, more than I ever saw in the city. I felt small under it, but peaceful. I crawled into my sleeping bag around 11. The tent smelled faintly of smoke from my jacket. The cold seeped in through the floor, and the forest settled into that deep, distant kind of quiet again. At some point during the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was, but it was pitch black, and the air inside the tent felt cold enough to sting when I breathed. I thought I'd heard something outside, maybe branches cracking. I lay still and listened. There was movement, not fast but slow, deliberate. Something stepped on dry leaves just a few yards away from my tent. I held my breath, trying to convince myself it was just a deer. There were plenty of them in these parts, but the steps didn't sound like hooves. They sounded uneven, like a person walking barefoot on sticks. There'd be a crunch, then a pause, then another crunch. I reached for the small flashlight beside my sleeping bag, but I didn't turn it on. I just held it tight, waiting. The sound stopped for a while. I thought maybe whatever it was had gone back into the trees. Then I heard it again, closer this time. I could make out breathing, faint but rough, like someone who'd been running. The tent's thin nylon wall moved slightly, just enough that I could tell something was right outside. I could hear it drag its foot or hand across the side of the tent, the sound of skin or fur brushing the fabric. I froze. My mouth went dry. My mind was racing, trying to come up with an explanation. Maybe a hiker? But who the hell would hike this far into the woods at night, without a light, without saying anything? I finally built up the nerve to click on the flashlight. The second the light came on, everything outside went completely silent. I didn't even hear crickets, just dead, still air. I waited, shining the beam toward the tent wall. Nothing moved. After maybe a minute, I slowly unzipped the tent flap just enough to look out. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow cone, hitting the edge of the trees. I didn't see anyone or anything, but I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were fresh prints in the dirt, not boot prints or animal tracks. They looked human, but they were wrong. The toes were long, almost too long, and the arch was strange, flat and stretched. They led from the tree line straight to my tent, then back toward the woods. I zipped the tent back up fast. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped the flashlight once. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, waiting. I didn't sleep again that night. I just kept the light on until the sky outside turned gray with dawn. When morning finally came, I stepped out. The air felt different, heavy. The forest looked normal, but the ground around my campsite told another story. The prints were real, clearer in the daylight. I followed them a few feet toward the trees, but they faded out as the ground turned to pine needles. I didn't want to go any farther. I thought about packing up right then and there, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it really was some animal. Maybe my tired brain had made the prints look worse than they were. I stayed another day, but I kept my fire bigger and closer to the tent that night. That evening, I noticed how quickly it got dark. It wasn't gradual, it was like the light just dropped out of the sky all at once. The woods turned black, and the air got cold fast. I sat by the fire, eating a bar, when I heard something again, faint but familiar. The same dragging sound, the same soft steps in the leaves. I froze mid-bite. The noise circled the camp slowly, always just far enough that I couldn't see anything in the light. It didn't move like an animal. It sounded like someone pacing, keeping a distance. I stared into the dark until my eyes burned. Then I saw something, or someone. At the edge of the trees, about 30 feet away, there was a figure. It was standing completely still. The firelight barely reached it, but I could tell it was tall, maybe 6.5 feet. Its arms seemed too long, almost reaching its knees. Its head was tilted a little to one side, like it was trying to study me. I stood up slowly. My legs felt weak. The thing didn't move. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could see pale skin, maybe dirt-covered, and what looked like tangled hair hanging down. For a long time, neither of us moved. Then it stepped back into the dark, soundless this time. I didn't sleep that night either. I sat in the tent with a knife in my hand, staring at the flap, waiting for it to move. It never did, but I heard the noises off and on, crunches, dragging, breathing until sunrise. The next morning, I packed everything fast. I didn't even eat. I just wanted to get out. When I turned the truck around to leave, I noticed something in the dirt behind where I'd parked. The same prints again. This time there were more of them, circling the tent site, overlapping, some smaller, some large. One print stopped only a few inches from where my head would have been when I slept. The drive back felt longer than before. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow between the trees felt like something was there, following me. When I finally got to pavement again, I stopped at a gas station just to breathe. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold my drink. The cashier asked if I was okay, and I just nodded. I didn't know what to say. For weeks after that, I couldn't stop thinking about that figure, the way it stood there, watching me, almost human but not right. I tried to tell myself it was just some guy out there, maybe a hermit, maybe someone on drugs, but that didn't make sense. There were no camps, no vehicles, nothing out there for miles. I looked up reports later about strange sightings in that area. Missing livestock, weird noises at night, people saying they'd seen figures that mimicked voices or shapes. Most people laughed it off as legends, but every time I remember that sound, the way it moved around my tent, the prints, I can't laugh. I've gone camping plenty of times since then, but never alone, and never anywhere near Kaibab again. Even now, years later, when I wake up in the middle of the night and the house is quiet, I sometimes hear that same slow, uneven step in my head, the sound of something that almost walks like a man but isn't. And I know that whatever was out there that night wasn't a story or a shadow. It was real, and it was watching me. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to take a short break from the city and go camping alone. I had been working long hours, my head buried in a computer screen, and I needed quiet. Just a few nights of nothing but open fields, wind, and the sound of insects. A friend of mine knew a man who owned a large piece of farmland in southern Illinois, miles away from the nearest town. The land wasn't really used anymore, just old barns, fields of overgrown grass, and a small pond hidden behind a row of trees. It sounded perfect to me. I wanted space, privacy, and peace. I packed up my tent, a small cooler, some canned food, a folding chair, and my sleeping bag. The drive took about 6 hours from Chicago. As I got closer, the roads narrowed from highways to small cracked asphalt paths lined with wildflowers and wooden fences. I saw fewer and fewer houses the deeper I went. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the farm, my phone had already lost service. The property was massive. The main farmhouse looked abandoned, windows boarded up, the paint on the siding faded and peeling. To the left of it stood an old red barn, its roof slightly caved in, and beyond that stretched wide fields of yellow grass. I parked near a line of oak trees that looked strong enough to block some of the wind. The air smelled faintly of soil and hay. It was quiet, completely quiet, not the kind of quiet you get in a park, but the kind that makes you notice your own breathing. I set up my tent a few hundred feet from the barn, close enough for shelter if it rained, but far enough that the shadows from the barn wouldn't fall over my camp. The sun was hot, but the breeze made it comfortable. I spent the first afternoon walking around the place. The barn door hung open on one hinge, squeaking whenever the wind picked up. Inside, there were piles of hay so old they turned to dust when I stepped on them. A few rusted tools were scattered around, and in one corner was a stack of animal cages, small ones maybe for chickens or rabbits. I found a broken ladder leaning against the wall and climbed up to the loft. From there, I could see over the whole field. The land stretched for what looked like miles, with a few fence posts leaning at odd angles, long since forgotten. As the sun started to go down, I made a small fire and heated up a can of soup. The sky turned orange and then deep red. Fireflies came out and floated above the tall grass. I remember thinking how peaceful it was. I hadn't felt that kind of quiet in years. When it got dark, I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and lay back listening to the distant hum of insects. Sometime around midnight, I woke up. I didn't know what had stirred me at first. Then I heard it. A faint sound, like something dragging against the ground, came from somewhere near the barn. I held still, thinking maybe it was an animal. The wind had died completely, and every small noise felt amplified. The dragging sound stopped for a moment, then started again, slower this time. I sat up quietly and unzipped the tent flap just a little. The fire had gone out, and my eyes took a while to adjust to the dark. The barn stood like a black shape against the dim sky. I couldn't see much, but I noticed movement near the open doorway. A faint shape, maybe a person or maybe just shadows. My stomach tightened. I didn't move. After a few minutes, the sound faded away. I told myself it must have been a deer or maybe the wind shifting something loose. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though it was a light, uneasy sleep. The next morning, the first thing I did was check the area around the barn. I found something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt just outside the door. They weren't boots or shoes, bare feet. The prints were small, maybe a child's, but there were too many. They circled the barn, leading toward the field and vanishing into the grass. I stood there for a while, staring at them. There was no house nearby, no sign of anyone else. It made no sense. That day, I tried to focus on normal things. I fished a little in the pond, cooked another can of soup, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. By evening, I'd almost convinced myself the footprints were old, maybe from the previous owner's kids years ago. But that night, the noise came back. It started around the same time, close to midnight. This time, it wasn't dragging. It was footsteps, slow, uneven footsteps circling my tent. I froze. I didn't breathe. I could hear the grass crunching softly under each step. They went all the way around once, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise itself. My heartbeat felt so loud I thought whoever, or whatever it was, could hear it. Minutes passed. I didn't move until the sound faded into the distance. When morning came, I packed my things fast. I was ready to leave, but as I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something that made me stop cold. On the side of my tent, smeared faintly in dirt, was a handprint. A small one, too small for an adult. I stood there staring at it for a long time. The fingers were thin, the palms small, and the print was low to the ground, as if whoever made it had been crouching. I checked the ground again and saw more of those same barefoot tracks, leading toward the barn and disappearing behind it. I almost left right then, but my curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the barn one last time. The air inside was heavy, thick with the smell of rot. I went around to the back and found an old cellar door half buried under weeds. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. The wood was swollen and cracked, but one of the hinges had been recently broken. The door was slightly open, maybe an inch or two. I knelt down and looked inside. The smell hit me immediately, something sour, decaying. It was pitch black. I couldn't see anything past the first few steps leading downward. I listened, holding my breath, and for a few seconds I thought I heard something faint below, like a quiet shuffle or a breath. I backed away slowly. That was enough for me. I didn't go back for the cooler or the folding chair. I threw everything else into the car and left the tent behind. I drove down that dirt road faster than I should have, heart pounding, constantly checking the rearview mirror even though I knew there was nothing there. When I finally reached a gas station about 30 miles away, I pulled over. I sat there for a long time trying to calm down. The station attendant must have thought I looked crazy. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was just squatters, maybe kids living on that property, hiding out, using the barn for shelter. But something about those prints didn't sit right. The number of them, the size, the way they were all over the place like someone had been crawling instead of walking. A week later, I looked up the property online. It had belonged to a man named Roger Tillman, who died in the early 2000s. There was a note in one of the local news archives about him losing his daughter in an accident years before he died. She was 6. The search didn't say much else, just that she went missing one evening and was never found. I didn't tell anyone about what I saw or heard. I've camped plenty of times since then, but never on farmland and never alone. Sometimes I still think about that night. The slow steps, the small handprint on my tent, and that cellar door slightly open. When I close my eyes, I can still see that field, stretching out in every direction, quiet and empty, like nothing ever happened there. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw, and I'll never go back. It was late October 2014 when I decided to take a hunting trip up in the northern part of Montana, near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. I was 28 at the time, still young enough to think I could handle the cold and isolation of the woods by myself. I'd been hunting most of my life, but this trip wasn't really about getting anything specific. It was about clearing my head. I'd been working long weeks at a construction job, barely sleeping, barely eating, just feeling worn down. The quiet of the forest always fixed that for me. I drove up early in the morning, the road twisting through long stretches of pine and spruce, the kind of forest that feels older than anything man could ever build. I remember the smell, that clean, frozen air mixed with resin and wet dirt. I parked my old Silverado at a small pull-off off the logging road, where the gravel faded into mud. From there, it was a 4-mile hike to the spot I'd planned to camp. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was dipping behind the ridges. I set up camp quickly. Small 2-person tent, sleeping bag, portable stove, and enough gear for 3 days. The air was colder than I'd expected. My breath hung heavy in the air. The ground was hard, crusted with early frost, and the forest around me was quiet in that heavy, dense way that makes you feel like something's watching you. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but that night had a stillness that sat wrong with me. I cooked some beans and venison I'd packed, ate in silence, then sat by the small fire I'd built. The trees around my camp reached high, black against the faint orange glow of the flames. Every now and then, I'd hear small sounds, a branch snapping, a far-off rustle, normal forest stuff. Still, it made me uneasy. There was no wind, no animal calls, nothing but those sudden, small noises. When I finally crawled into the tent, I lay awake for a long time, listening. Sometime past midnight, I heard something move close, maybe 30 yards away. It wasn't fast like a deer. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. My heartbeat got loud in my ears, and I stayed frozen, listening. It stopped after a while, and I tried convincing myself it was just an elk or maybe a black bear moving through. But bears don't walk that quietly. I woke early, the ground hard and cold under me. My boots were stiff from the frost, and my breath came out in little white clouds. I boiled water for coffee and stood there, staring into the line of trees. There were faint tracks leading out of the clearing, not boots, not hooves. Something bare, human-like, but wider, longer. I crouched down and touched the frozen dirt. The prints looked fresh, pressed deep into the frost. I told myself maybe some camper had passed through during the night, but no one camps this deep without a vehicle nearby, and I hadn't seen another truck for miles. I packed my rifle and decided to scout further uphill. The forest grew thicker as I climbed, full of fallen branches and thick moss. I found some elk sign, droppings mostly, but no real tracks worth following. Still, I kept going. By midday, the air had warmed slightly, and the forest felt less hostile. I was about 2 miles from camp when I caught a smell. Something foul, like rotting meat mixed with wet leaves. It wasn't unusual to smell death in the woods, but this one was stronger, sour. I followed it a little ways until I found what was left of a deer. Bones mostly torn apart, ribs bent outward. The meat had been eaten down to shreds, but the head was still there, eyes gone. Predators eat like that, I thought. Could have been wolves, or a bear. Still, the pattern didn't look right. The bones were cleanly split, not chewed. It looked more like something had broken them apart with force. I didn't stay long. I turned back toward camp, checking over my shoulder more than I wanted to admit. That night, I built a bigger fire and kept my rifle closer. The woods were silent again, like the night before, but heavier. I ate quick and sat with my back to a log, staring into the dark. When I finally crawled into my tent, I kept the zipper halfway open, watching the firelight flicker through the opening. The sound started again around midnight. The same slow, careful steps, closer this time. My chest felt tight, like my heartbeat was echoing inside my head. I stayed completely still. Something moved past the tent, brushing against the fabric so lightly that I almost didn't feel it. Then a crunch, something stepping on a branch right next to me. I held my breath until my chest hurt. The sound lingered for a while, then drifted away into the trees. I don't think I slept again after that. When dawn came, I stepped out with my rifle ready. The fire had burned out to coals, and the forest looked calm again, like nothing had happened. But near the edge of my camp, in the soft patch of dirt by a tree, I saw it again, the same kind of footprints, human-shaped, bare. And this time, there were more of them, at least 2 different sets. I packed up fast. My plan was to head back to the truck and just leave. Hunting didn't seem worth it anymore. I slung my pack over my shoulder and started down the trail, moving quick. The woods were quiet again, but that silence didn't feel peaceful now. It felt like a warning. Every few minutes, I stopped and listened, half expecting to hear footsteps behind me. I didn't, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following. When I got near the last ridge before the valley, I saw movement through the trees. Just a flicker, something dark between the pines. I froze. For a long minute, nothing happened. Then I saw it again, closer. A figure, tall, thin, moving awkwardly, like it wasn't used to walking. I couldn't make out the face, just the shape. It looked human, but something about the way it moved made my stomach twist. I raised my rifle, not to shoot, but just to steady myself. The figure stopped. We stood there, motionless, maybe 40 yards apart. The air felt heavier than before, pressing down on me. Then it turned, not fast, just turned, and stepped back into the trees. I didn't wait to see where it went. I started walking faster, nearly jogging by the time I reached the clearing where I'd parked. When I got to the truck, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely fit the key in the ignition. I didn't look back once. I drove straight out, tires spinning in the mud, eyes flicking to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The road was empty. The woods faded behind me. That night, I stayed at a cheap motel in Kalispell. I remember standing under the shower for a long time, trying to get warm, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Human, but not quite. Too long, too wide, and the way that thing moved through the trees, like it wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't go back to that area after that trip. For a while, I tried convincing myself it had just been some hermit or poacher living off the land. Maybe someone half crazy from being alone too long. That's what I tell people if they ask why I stopped hunting up north. But there's one thing that still eats at me. When I was cleaning my truck a week later, I noticed something on the back bumper. A handprint. Large, bare, pressed into the thin layer of dried mud. It wasn't mine. The fingers were longer than they should have been, and the spacing was wrong. I scrubbed it off, but for weeks afterward, I kept waking up at night thinking I heard footsteps outside my window. I haven't been camping alone since. I went camping alone in southern France in the summer of 2018. I had been traveling through Europe for a few weeks after finishing university and wanted a break from cities and hostels. I found a quiet, cheap campsite near a small village outside of Carcassonne, surrounded by forest and old farmlands. It wasn't an official site, more like a patch of private land that a farmer allowed people to use if they paid him a small fee. There were only 2 or 3 other tents scattered around, but they were far apart from mine. I picked a spot near a stream under some tall poplar trees. The place felt peaceful during the day, warm sunlight, faint buzzing of insects, soft smell of pine and dry soil. The first day passed quietly. I walked around the nearby hills, cooked some pasta on my small gas stove, and read a book until it got dark. When the night came, the temperature dropped fast, and everything went silent except for the slow, steady sound of the stream beside my tent. I lay there for a while, just listening. There's something strange about silence in the woods. It makes every tiny noise feel important. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps, very faint, crunching softly through the dried leaves. At first, I thought it was just an animal, a deer or maybe a stray dog. I didn't move, but I could tell the sound wasn't random. It was slow, deliberate. A few steps, then a pause, then a few more, like someone trying to move quietly. My tent was zipped shut, and I could only see dim light from the moon pressing through the fabric. The footsteps stopped close to the stream, maybe 10 meters away. I held my breath and waited. After a minute, they faded away. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe another camper walking around, or someone from the village taking a shortcut through the woods. But it still made me uneasy. The next morning, when I went to fetch water, I saw footprints in the soft mud near the stream. They were small, barefoot prints, clearly human. The toes were pressed deep into the ground like whoever it was had been standing still there for a while. I tried not to think too much about it. I spent the rest of the day biking to a nearby town to buy some bread and canned food. When I got back late in the afternoon, I noticed that one of my tent flaps was unzipped. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. Nothing seemed stolen, but my sleeping bag had been moved, and my backpack was lying open. It felt like someone had gone through my things. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing little sounds outside, sticks snapping, faint rustling near the trees. Around 2 a.m., I opened the zipper just a bit to peek outside. The moon was out, washing everything in pale light. For a while, I didn't see anything. Then I spotted movement near the trees across the stream. It was a woman. She was standing half hidden behind a trunk, facing my direction. She wasn't close enough for me to see her face clearly, but she looked thin, with long hair hanging down the sides of her head. She was wearing a pale dress, almost white, that looked dirty and torn at the bottom. She stood completely still, her body slightly turned like she was trying to look at me without stepping forward. My chest felt heavy, and my hands were sweating. I froze, staring at her for what felt like minutes, until I couldn't handle it anymore. I zipped the tent back up and lay down, pretending to sleep, though my heart was beating too fast for me to actually rest. When the sun rose, I got out quickly. There was no one there. I looked across the stream, no footprints this time, but the grass was flattened in one spot like someone had been standing there. I packed my stuff slowly that morning, thinking about leaving, but I convinced myself again that maybe she was just some local woman wandering, maybe lost, maybe living off-grid. I didn't want to sound paranoid. The following night, the air was still and heavy. Not even the crickets made noise. I was sitting by my small campfire, eating bread and tuna, when I felt that same uneasy sense that someone was watching me. I turned around and saw her again. This time she was closer, maybe 15 meters away, standing at the edge of the trees. She wasn't moving. The firelight flickered across her face for a second, and I saw that her eyes looked hollow, dark under the shadows, and her skin was pale like she hadn't seen sunlight for a long time. She looked filthy, her hair tangled, her dress stained brown and gray. She didn't do anything. She just stood there, facing me, hands hanging by her sides. My throat went dry. I didn't speak or move. I could feel my whole body tense. After a while, she stepped back slowly into the trees and disappeared. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, I decided I was done. I started packing everything up fast. But when I unzipped my tent, I saw something that stopped me completely. On the ground right in front of the entrance, there was a piece of bread, part of a baguette, cut cleanly in half. It wasn't mine. I hadn't left it there. It was like someone had placed it there carefully. I looked around again. The woods were quiet. The air smelled faintly of smoke, but not from my fire. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a soft crack, like someone stepping on a branch. I grabbed my backpack, stuffed everything inside, and left the tent behind. I didn't even roll it up, just started walking fast toward the dirt road that led back to the village. The walk back felt endless. Every sound behind me made me turn my head. At one point, I thought I saw someone far down the path, walking behind me, but when I stopped to look properly, there was nothing. When I finally reached the village, I felt my whole body relax for the first time in 2 days. I went straight to a small cafe and sat there until I stopped shaking. Later that day, I talked to the farmer who owned the land, trying to explain that I'd seen someone out there. He seemed surprised but not shocked. He told me in broken English that a woman had lived in those woods years ago, alone in a shack after her husband died. She used to walk near the campsite sometimes, looking for food or bottles to sell, but she disappeared after a bad winter a few years back. He said people sometimes still claimed to see her wandering, but he laughed it off, saying it was probably just stories. I didn't laugh. I just nodded, thanked him, and left. I stayed that night in a cheap motel near the highway. I remember lying in bed, feeling strange relief that I was behind a locked door again. A week later, I was back home in England. I tried to forget the whole thing, but I couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she had stood there, watching silently, the strange piece of bread left outside my tent. I kept wondering if she had been homeless, living somewhere in the woods, or if she had just been curious, lonely maybe. But the thought that stayed with me most was how quietly she moved, how close she must have come while I slept, and how easily she could have done anything she wanted while I lay there unaware. It made me realize how fragile that thin layer of safety really is when you're out there alone. You think you're camping, surrounded by nature, away from people, but sometimes the scariest thing out there isn't the wild. It's the people who live unnoticed in it, the ones who have stopped being seen but still see you. I haven't gone camping alone since then. Every time I think about it, I picture that pale woman standing still among the trees, her eyes fixed on me like she had been waiting for something. I don't know what it was, and I don't want to find out. I went camping alone for the first time in the summer of 2013. I was 24 then, living in Northern Oregon, working a boring warehouse job that ran from Monday to Friday. That year had felt heavier than usual. Too much routine, too much noise, too many people around all the time. I needed a weekend to disappear. I packed my tent, sleeping bag, small cooler, and an old lantern into my beat-up Subaru and drove toward the edge of the Deschutes National Forest. The area I picked wasn't a popular campsite. I'd found it on an old hiking forum. Someone mentioned a clearing about 3 miles off the main trail where few people ever went. I wanted quiet, real quiet. I wanted to wake up and not hear cars or phones, just wind and trees. The hike to the spot took me most of the afternoon. The air smelled like pine and damp soil, and the trail was narrow and muddy in places. I remember my shirt sticking to my back, sweat soaking through, and the sound of distant thunder rolling over the hills. It wasn't supposed to rain that weekend, at least according to the forecast, but Oregon weather doesn't follow rules. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was hanging low. The spot was perfect, flat ground, surrounded by thick trees, and just close enough to a small creek that I could hear the trickling water. I set up my tent, unpacked, collected some dry wood, and made a small fire before dark. I ate a sandwich sitting by the flames, listening to the quiet between gusts of wind. Every now and then, I'd hear branches snap somewhere out in the woods, but I didn't think much of it. It's the forest. There's always something moving. When night came, the air turned colder than I expected. I crawled into my sleeping bag and turned off the lantern. I lay there for a long time, staring at the thin nylon of the tent roof, listening. The forest has a way of making you feel small when it's dark. Every sound feels closer, sharper. I could hear the creek, the wind pushing through the trees, the occasional hoot of an owl. Then came something else, something heavier. It was a sound like slow, uneven steps on soft ground. I froze, holding my breath. The steps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. My first thought was a deer, maybe an elk. But the rhythm was wrong, too slow, too careful. It stopped again, and I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. I reached for my flashlight, turned it on, and aimed it toward the tent wall. The beam showed nothing but shadows of trees swaying outside. I told myself to relax. I must have been imagining it. But then something brushed against the side of the tent, light but definite, like a hand or an animal's body pressing against the fabric. My chest tightened. I stayed still, not daring to breathe. After a few seconds, it was gone. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, flashlight in hand, every nerve wired. The steps didn't come back, and after a while, the forest went silent again. When the first light of morning came, I got out and checked the ground around the tent. There were footprints, not boots or shoes, bare feet. I counted at least 7 distinct prints circling my tent. Some were partial, like whoever made them had been stepping carefully, trying not to make noise. The prints were small, but not like a child's, maybe a woman's size, maybe a teenager's. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to laugh it off, telling myself someone else might have camped nearby and wandered through my area. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was had been watching me while I slept or tried to sleep. I decided to stay one more night, mostly because I didn't want to admit how nervous I was. I hiked down to the creek, filled my water bottle, washed my face, and tried to clear my head. I didn't see anyone the whole day. By evening, clouds had rolled in again. The air grew heavy and still, the kind of stillness that comes right before rain. I built another fire, cooked a small meal, and tried to stay calm. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. When rain started falling, I put out the fire and retreated to my tent. The sound of the rain on the nylon roof was almost comforting. I started to feel stupid for being scared. Then, sometime around midnight, I woke up to the sound of the rain stopping. It was that sudden silence that wakes you instantly, like your brain knows something changed. The air felt thicker, colder. I couldn't hear the creak anymore. No wind, no insects, just silence. Then came the soft crunching sound again. This time it was closer, moving around the tent slowly. I grabbed the flashlight again, hand shaking. The steps paused, and I could hear faint breathing, slow, uneven. I didn't move. The sound came from just outside the tent flap. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then something tugged at the zipper. Not yanked, just pulled slightly, like testing it. I jolted upright and shouted. The sound came out rough and cracked, but it worked. The footsteps retreated quickly, fading into the trees. I kept the light on and sat there for what felt like hours, waiting for it to come back. It never did. When morning came, I packed up immediately. The air smelled like wet leaves, and fog hung low over the trees. I looked around the clearing one last time before leaving. The footprints were there again, this time leading right up to the tent entrance and then back into the woods. I hiked out fast, barely stopping to drink water. My legs were shaking the whole time. When I finally reached the car, I locked the doors before even sitting down. The moment I turned the ignition and heard the engine start, I felt a kind of relief that's hard to explain. As I drove down the dirt road toward the highway, I saw something on the edge of the tree line, a shape standing still between the pines. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. It looked like a person, tall and thin, wearing dark clothes. They didn't move, just stood there, watching the car pass. I couldn't see their face. I didn't stop. I just kept driving until the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. When I got home that evening, I unpacked everything in the driveway. My tent still had small streaks of mud where the hand, or whatever it was, had brushed against it. I threw it out the next day. I didn't tell anyone what happened. It sounded crazy even to me. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every little noise outside my window made me tense up. Sometimes, in those sleepless nights, I'd think about those bare footprints circling the tent, the slow breathing outside, and how whoever it was had been careful, so careful, not to wake me at first. The strangest part came about a month later. I was scrolling through local news online when I found an article about a missing woman. Her name was Allison Grant, 32, last seen hiking alone near the same area I'd camped in. They said her car was found parked near the trailhead, but there were no signs of her anywhere. Her photo stopped me cold. The face looked familiar, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was just my mind making connections it wanted to make, but something in my gut twisted when I saw her eyes. I never went camping alone again after that. Every now and then, when I drive through that part of Oregon, I still think about that night. The soft rain, the silence that followed, and the sound of something human breathing just a few feet away from me in the dark. And I still wonder if she was out there that night too, lost or hiding, or watching me from the edge of the trees, waiting for something I'll never understand. It was the summer of 2018 when I decided to go camping alone in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had been planning that trip for months. I wanted peace, a quiet place away from work and people. I had gone camping many times before, but this time felt different because the place I picked was remote, somewhere deep beyond the marked trails. I drove an old silver Tacoma pickup, the kind with a small camper shell in the back. I loaded it with a tent, a sleeping bag, a portable stove, food, a folding chair, and enough firewood to last me a few days. I also brought my rifle, not because I expected to hunt, but because you never know what's out there. Bears, wolves, or sometimes people who don't belong that deep in the woods. The sky had been gray since morning, and by the time I reached the dirt road that led to the clearing I'd marked on my map, it had started to drizzle. The rain wasn't heavy at first, just small drops tapping against the windshield, but the deeper I drove, the harder it fell. The road turned muddy, and my tires kicked up thick, wet clumps of dirt. By the time I reached the clearing, it was nearly evening. The rain had picked up, falling in sheets, steady and cold. I parked near a group of pine trees and started setting up camp. The ground was soft and uneven, my boots sinking slightly with each step. It took me longer than usual to get the tent up because the wind kept pulling the fabric, and my hands were cold and wet. When I was finally done, I made a small fire under a tarp I stretched between two trees. The smoke rose unevenly in the rain, the smell of wet wood mixing with the sharp scent of pine. The forest around me was thick, too thick. Even in daylight, you couldn't see far beyond the tree line. The sound of the rain drowned out almost everything else. After eating a small meal, I sat near the fire and listened. The forest felt heavy, muffled by the rain. There were no insects buzzing, no distant calls of animals. Just the endless hiss of water falling through branches. I tried not to think too much about it. Silence like that always gets under your skin when you're alone. When it got dark, I climbed into my tent. The sound of rain hitting the fabric was constant, almost rhythmic. I remember lying there, staring at the faint light of my lantern, feeling a strange kind of calm. But that didn't last long. Around midnight, I woke up. It wasn't the rain that woke me. It was something else. A sound. Faint, but sharp enough to pull me out of sleep. Came from outside, somewhere near the trees. It wasn't an animal noise. It sounded like something metallic, like the quick click of metal hitting metal. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The rain was still falling, heavier now, but between the gusts of wind, I heard it again, that short, unnatural click. I thought it could be the wind knocking something loose from my truck, or maybe the buckle of my cooler shifting in the rain. I unzipped the tent halfway and shined my flashlight toward the clearing. The beam of light hit the wet ground, the fire pit, the truck. Nothing unusual. I couldn't see far enough to the trees, though. The rain reflected the light, making it hard to see anything beyond a few feet. I crawled out anyway, my boots sinking in the mud. The cold hit me instantly, soaking through my jacket. I walked toward the truck, sweeping the light around. Everything looked normal until I reached the back. The cooler I'd left beside the tailgate was open. The latch was unhooked. I knew for sure I'd locked it earlier. I remember because I had to shove it down hard to make it click. At first, I thought maybe a raccoon or something had managed to open it, but there were no claw marks, no signs of food dragged away. The lid was just open, sitting there, clean. I stood there for a while, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other, waiting for something to move. Nothing did. I shut the cooler, latched it again, and went back to the tent. I told myself it was probably just the rain and my imagination. I wanted to believe that. When I got back inside, I left the lantern off this time. I lay there listening again. For a long time, it was just rain. Then, after maybe 20 minutes, I heard it again. Not the click this time. It was a sound like something brushing lightly against fabric. My tent fabric. My whole body went still. The sound came from the right side, near the back. It was slow, steady, like fingers sliding against wet canvas. I held my breath. It lasted maybe 5 seconds and then stopped. I waited. The rain kept falling. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I finally grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the side where I'd heard it. But all I saw was the wet fabric shaking from the wind. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, sitting up with my rifle across my lap. The rain didn't stop, not once. When daylight finally came, Everything outside was gray and dripping. The fire pit was flooded. The ground was a pool of mud, and the trees looked almost black against the sky. I walked around camp, checking everything. The cooler was closed this time. The only thing that looked off was a set of boot prints, not mine, about 20 feet from my tent. They were half washed away by the rain, but I could still see the shape, bigger than mine. And there were at least 3 distinct prints before they disappeared into the mud near the tree line. That was enough for me. I started packing right away. My hands were shaking the whole time, not from the cold but from something else. That deep, sick feeling in your stomach when you know something isn't right. By the time I got everything loaded, it was late morning. The rain was still steady, but I didn't care. I got into the truck and started the engine. For a moment, I looked out toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there watching. There was nothing, just the rain falling in long, silent sheets. As I drove out, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. The road was narrow, full of puddles, and the forest felt endless. I didn't relax until I reached the main gravel road that led back toward town. When I finally stopped at a small diner on the way home, I looked at the back of my truck again. The cooler was gone, completely gone. The latch hadn't broken, the whole thing was missing. I knew I had locked it down with a bungee cord before leaving. I checked twice. I just stood there in the rain, staring at the empty spot in the truck bed. I couldn't explain it. Maybe someone followed me out there. Maybe they were already camping nearby and saw me. I don't know. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. That night, I unpacked everything, checked every latch, every bag. I kept thinking about those prints and how clean that cooler latch looked. Someone had opened it carefully, like they didn't want to make noise. I never went camping alone again after that. Whenever I think about it, I don't imagine ghosts or monsters. Just a person, standing out there in the rain, watching quietly as I slept. Because out there, in a place that remote, the scariest thing isn't what you can't see. It's knowing that something or someone was close enough to touch your tent without making a sound. And the worst part is not knowing if they ever left.